All right, welcome everybody. It looks like I survived lunch. I got no ketchup or mustard stains on my shirt or anywhere, so good. All right, we're going to be talking today. I had two very good questions. It's about addiction, and to explain, it's best to combine both questions together. The first question is about there being such a thing as an addictive personality. And then the other person wants to know about what causes addiction. I think two very good questions which interrelate. First, most of us working with substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder would all agree that they're repetitive personality themes. I say substance and alcohol use disorder because the word addiction has taken on an expanded connotation, like Bruce, he's really addicted to his cell phone. Or Jill, she has such an addiction to social media. So we've all heard of that. So there's this expanding vernacular, a generalized lexicon that loses, clinically it loses its descriptive powers in that sense, in the clinical sense. Also another reason why the word addiction is losing its appeal is researchers cannot come to a full agreement on what exactly denotes addiction. So it's hard to define. It was once thought that tolerance and withdrawal were clear indicators of chemical addictive properties. But it's hard and unfair to apply that descriptive measurement for someone who has to take opiates for chronic pain. Yes, the body does develop a dependence on that substance, like fentanyl or morphine. So to describe a chronic pain patient as an addict is misleading and unfair. Plus, and this is interesting, we also see withdrawal and tolerance from other behaviors, like pornography or the insistent use of electronic devices. Research participants, they clearly exhibit anxiety and psychological distress when you take away their cell phone. Also, we've seen this trajectory of a more hardcore pornography viewing to satiate desire. For example, Dad's old Playboy no longer excites and arouses, so therefore a more graphic nature ensues, is needed. So as you can see, it's really hard to define the word addiction. It's really hard to define addiction because clinically we don't include pornography or those oft repeated sexual activities or an addictive attachment to one's electronic devices as a diagnostic disorder. There's not enough clinical evidence to support that for those, and we have roughly about 800 disorders, conditions, or problems that's listed in our latest diagnostic and statistical manual for mental disorders, or what we call the DSM. It's in its 5th edition. I left my current copy at the other office, and so, but it's pretty thick and there's a lot of stuff in there. We use it to help us treat. So now we say use disorders of certain substances like amphetamine, cocaine, use disorder, heroin, marijuana, etc. But I'm going to use the term addiction just for ease of explanation and try to define addiction. Now, having taught educational programs, treating and having assisted in many addiction treatments, I feel from a professional stance there are two main indicators of actual addiction, and many of my colleagues agree. This will tie in to help me explain the two questions earlier. We talked about an addictive personality and what causes addiction. First, if someone repeats, the behavior over and over, despite the negative consequences, that is a clear indicator of addictive properties. If I continue to use despite losing my family, friends, all my money, possessions, health, and am constantly incarcerated, a case can be made, hey Sizemore, you're addicted. Okay? The second is a little trickier. It has to do with changes in the brain, and I brought half a brain, at the molecular level. I'm going to explain some things there. When I was in the master's and doctorate levels, my background was in psychology was a concentration in neuropsychology, and I use that to help inform treatment, especially when it comes to substance abuse or alcohol use disorders. So to explain what's going on in the brain, it's this. What happens is, this may sound confusing at first, behavior goes from impulsive to compulsive. Okay? Let me explain. A good example are smokers. The number one addictive chemical is nicotine, which attaches to our acetylcholine nicotinic receptors. When smokers first started, it was an impulsive act, in that it was consciously thought about. After time, it changed from impulsive to compulsive. Okay, from impulsive to compulsive, where it was unconsciously automatic. You can ask many long-term smokers if they have to think about lighting up, and they'll tell you no, not until you brought it to their attention. This is a compulsive act. Okay, I got a lot to cover, so I kind of look at my notes here real quick, make sure I stay on track. Okay. To explain impulsive versus compulsive, the brain is very, very efficient. Because if we do something over and over, it moves it from the conscious realm into subconscious, like brushing our teeth, playing a musical instrument, or driving a car. Many of us have been on for several hours. We've been on road trips, and when we arrive, we're kind of like we're surprised, that we're there. And it's really tough to remember the journey. Our brains, they've moved into what we call a default mode. Even though we are still performing a task, our minds wander and daydream or think about other things. If we had to think about everything we do, our brains would become overwhelmed and possibly seize or shut down. We see that with some forms of epilepsy and autism. They become so agitated that their brains have to respond accordingly to survive. Never eat ice cream before you need to talk. Okay? All right. Our brains will normally consume about 1/3 of our caloric intake. And when it does not have to think about something, it absolutely loves it. It shuffles it over to a subconscious neuronal cascade, what we call the default mode network. Have you ever felt wiped out or exhausted by only doing brain stuff like math or something that takes a lot of cerebral power? We're spent. And all we've done is just sit on our keisters. That's because the inordinate amount of energy this 3 pounds, this half, 1.5, of gelatinous mass consumes. So, where does that happen in the brain? As far as this compulsive, impulsive sort of occurrence. It's what we call the striatum, okay? And the striatum is composed of 2 parts, but it's located basically in this area right here. This is our brainstem, and this is what is known as the limbic system through here. We all have this. And it's all functional. Some of us a little bit different, and we'd probably swear some of us didn't have a brain at all. But that's what happens. The striatum, it has 2 parts, of which I'll explain too, and it controls the impulsivity and the compulsivity, okay? The impulsive drives, they get this shot of dopamine, which time I'll later explain, and that's in the ventral region of the striatum. Ventral means Latin for bottom, okay? That part includes what we call the nucleus accumbens and olfactory region, the smell. The smell, because it's right here, you can see the smell part. That's our olfactory bulb right there in that region in there, and that's the bottom part of it. The dorsal, which means upper, think of a fish's dorsal fin, is comprised of the putamen and caudate nucleus, which connects to our prefrontal cortex here on this area here. I'm sorry, my shoulder hurts, so I got to keep my arm down in that respect. And that the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, is our thinking part. So when we make a decision, even though it's by the striatum, it's when the dorsal does it, it's more of a impulsive act. Okay, so I'll explain a little bit more. Now, over time and repeated behaviors, that dopamine squirt is routed to the ventral striatum. You know, I told you the bottom part. And that's an automatic cue for behavior. I used to have a lot of fun explaining the ventral striatum in here in class. Think of it this way. Let's say you're the boss at work. Okay, you're the boss at work. That is, you're the prefrontal cortex. You're the PFC, this part here of it. Okay, and you're in charge of many, many people. Something comes up and you have to leave work in the middle of the day. So what you do is you find the stupidest person available. Even though they've been with the company the longest, that's your ventral striatum. And you put them in charge. Here's the deal. No one can have a meaningful conversation, and because the most incompetent person you can find is left in charge, doing the same incomprehensible thing over and over, okay? Because we can't believe that this person is that stupid, but that's our ventral striatum. And this defines compulsivity, by allowing the ventral striatum to rule. Now, this is the second part of addictive properties behind the repeating of the behavior over and over despite the negative consequences. I think that those two things clearly define addiction, but we can only witness the first behavior and not the second. We cannot go around scanning everyone's brain when we suspect an addictive behavior. So that's why we refer to it as use disorders, but still for the ease, I will continue to use addiction, okay? All right. So hopefully that sheds some light on addiction and what it may look like. But what really causes addiction? What causes it? Is it a predisposition of personality? I think there is some validity in that. But on the other hand, the person has to be exposed to the chemical. Okay? And they've had to have that environment that promotes its use. And then, thirdly, the physiological propensity to become addicted. Because we all know those who have used drugs or drank and not shown any signs of any addictive behaviors, and they're able to control their sauce, so to speak. So, I mean, we kind of all seen that. I used to teach this subject, and it was about a 12-hour block of instruction. So in about a 15-minute vlog, it's going to be difficult, but I'm going to try to explain as best I can. So here goes. First, there's strong evidence in heritability studies that there's a genetic link to becoming hooked. Now I'm talking about the genetic, predisposition. Does someone have that addictive personality? So they do. They have this genetic link to becoming hooked. They're a stone cold alcoholic or a consistent drug user despite what negative consequence occurs. To make it somewhat clear, I've got to very simply describe genetics here. And this is going to be just really simple, okay? We have 23 sets of chromosomes on each of our neurological cells, okay? I brought the dog's rope up here. I'll knock stuff off. Okay, we're going to say like this is a set of chromosomes, okay, together. One from mom, one from dad, okay? So if I take this cord here and splice it up into unequal segments, like here and here, you know, whatever, and just in different segments, that's what we call genes. Okay, those segments, those unequal segments, are what we call genes. So it's more than just one gene, okay? Within these genes are what is called single nucleotides. And we're just going to label them A, T, C, G for short. We're not going to get into that. With only A and T pairing up and C and G pairing up in these alternating combinations. You, me, every human match is identical at a 99% genetic coding. The other 1% is considered individual genetic coding, which makes you, and me. That 1% is referred to as a SNP, SMP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. Some of these SNPs become mutated and produce susceptibility to cancer, autism, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, multiple dystrophy, bipolar, schizophrenia, okay? All some other of these bad medical or psychological infirmities. Some are born with these SNPs, or as I've explained in an earlier vlog, by the course of environmental of occurrence, our genes change. We call that epigenetics, for bad or good, and it produces the amino proteins that's transported by our RNA, and that alters our chemical stew or soup, okay, in that. All right. So a gene is a segment along one of those 23 chromosome pairs, one from mom, the other from dad, containing a few hundred single nucleotides or up to 1 million. It's been said that if you stretch out a chromosome pair, it would measure approximately 6 foot in length. And that's a lot of information for sure. And the entire genome of one person would circle the globe, since we have trillions of genetic pairs. So hopefully you can get the feel for the complexity of reducing addiction proclivity down to a genetic level. It's very, very difficult to really hammer it down and to get very specific about it. So we're going to get into the genetic predisposition a little bit more specific, and geneticists have isolated approximately 80 genes. And remember, those are segments throughout a person's chromosomal structure, 23, 23rd has to do with our sex, that's implicated in addictive behaviors. But I want you to understand this is what we call correlation. It shows possible influence or not cause. For example, I can explain the cause of fire with the chemical properties involved. I can say these are the items needed to produce fire, hence a cause for fire. But in this instance, with predilection for addiction, it's backward. Geneticists look at the genetic similarities of someone who is labeled alcoholic or addict, terms I eschew, I don't like them. They see this correlation, not a causation. In other words, we are not sure if these SNPs cause addiction or come about by someone using and becoming addicted. Okay? It would be unethical to cause addiction just to see how our genes change. And there are many out there who show very similar genetic makeup in those 80 or so SNPs, but who do not have, or they never had a problem with drinking or using illicit substance in those genes, 80 genes. That's why there's a lot of tentativeness in a full-blown camp for genetic heritability. It can influence and does, but not always, which allows us to shift gears to more concrete influences of addiction. I've been working on a book titled The Right Reasons for Addiction, Why We Use. And hopefully before I die I can get it published. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I've come to discover for those trapped in the snare and the hijacking of our brain, to them, they have the right reasons. And it's a sad reality for them. My heart just breaks when I get involved in their stories. But first, before I explain, I want to make something very clear here. Addiction is a learned behavior. Let me say it again. Addiction is a learned behavior. No matter if someone feels a proclivity for abuse, or they come from an environment or a history of chemical exposure, or from abusive, neglectful childhoods, it is a learned behavior. There is always an initial choice to try a substance. Though I completely understand, to them it's the right choice. So how does addiction start? This is tricky. I'm going to explain the best I can. It's what we call prediction error, and it involves the neurotransmitter dopamine that I mentioned earlier. That is how we learn and encode those learning episodes in the memory. Dopamine plays a vital role in learning and in memory. I taught the 4 M's of dopamine. Memory, which is encoded learning. For example, don't stick that paperclip into an electrical socket, right? You remember that. Motivation, mood, and movement. Okay. Let me repeat. Memory, mood, motivation, and movement. So to explain prediction error in our brains, when something pleasurable occurs that was unexpected, such as getting money, a shot of dopamine is delivered to what we call the pleasure center, the nucleus accumbens. That is the ventral striatum, right? That's an area of our brain which stores dopamine. The dopamine comes from an area of our brain called the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, which is down here on the brain stem in this area, okay? Let's say you go to the ATM at 3 o'clock in the morning. And after doing a transaction, you don't get any money, so you hit it real hard 3 times, and then, man, this thing just starts spewing and spitting out money. Of course, getting unexpected money is felt as euphoric. So then our temporal areas, that's the side of our side, and our hippocampus, which is down here in the limbic area, along with our sight, our occipital lobes, our parietal lobes, or maybe our olfactory, if we have a smell there, they'll all encode that memory. So when we find ourselves later on in a similar situation, perhaps at the same place at the same time, dopamine is delivered ensuing motivation, or what is known in the substance abuse field as triggers and cravings. To strike that ATM hard 3 times, at a particular place, at a particular time in the morning. Maybe you're standing on 1 foot while singing Rocky Top, if you're a Tennessee fan. So, hence we've learned this error in prediction. We've learned from this error in prediction. Something that was not expected turned out to be pleasurable. The unexpected pleasure of alcohol and drugs do that to the brain the first time, but not subsequent times. Our brains say, hey, pay attention. Remember, this was great. Dopamine helps the brain encode initial pleasurable activities that were unexpected, what we call an error prediction, hence memory. Then when we find ourselves in similar circumstance later on, Dopamine is delivered for motivation to repeat the pleasurable occurrence. We know what to expect, prediction. Because we've done, the ATM may do it again. So triggers and cravings get the dopamine squirt, causing motivation for the predictive encounter. If it doesn't occur, we get this chemical called dynorphin. It's an endogenous opioid, and it's released, causing its extinction. Eventually, it'll go extinct. Dopamine plays a major role in mood in our limbic region, the forearm's mood. Ask someone coming off a meth high how they feel. The brain has released a lot of dopamine from that VTA here on the brainstem, and they don't have the supply for normal regulation. They feel amotivated, their mood is black, their muscles are weak, and they just have trouble moving. We also sometimes will see the shakes, tremors similar to Parkinson's dementia, which Parkinson's dementia is caused by inefficient supply of dopamine. But I want you to understand, dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. It's there for memory, mood, movement, and motivation. But it does have euphoric properties in the nucleus accumbens, remember, the ventral striatum, or it's better known as a reward circuit. A lot of veteran addicts or alcoholics will tell you it is the expectation for the substance that charges them. Motivation. When the substance is introduced, it's to balance the system, okay? What we call an allostatic charge for body homeostasis. All of nature, including our bodies, continually seek, and it works for balance, allostasis. And when it reaches balance, it's what we call homeostatic. So when we ingest a pleasurable substance, it is dopamine that motivates a want. And endorphins and enkephalins, opioids, activate the liking. When you like somebody, it's those opioids that get you to like. When you yearn to see them, that is the dopamine causing you to have motivation to go see them. And I like explaining it this way because I explained the endogenous opioids. They're the liking of something, and dopamine is the want, okay? I like describing the opioids as the godfather of neurochemicals. It basically affects and controls just a lot, and it's throughout our entire system, okay? Back to what causes addiction. There are 3 models I propose for sustainment of addiction and why we use. Number 1 is what is known as the disease model. And it's touted by the medical community and a majority of substance abuse counselors. Okay, the reason they do it is because it's still what's taught at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Additionally, and sadly, in order for what we call third-party payers, insurance companies, to pay for treatment, they have to see it as a medical disease. They have to see substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, as a medical disease. Now, there's a lot of validity in this model, which I explained earlier about what occurs in the brain. Our logic part, the prefrontal cortex here, what makes us human, it grows quiet and reticent, and it allows the lower portion of the limbic, our emotional system, to run the show. It's our emotional, animalistic portion of our brains. We've put Dilbert in charge of the nuclear reactor, our ventral striatum right there. Okay? And, poor Delbert, he's not sure about what is fusion or fission and what flipping this switch will do. It's just basically feed me now, okay? And it happens over time, and that's why the brain gets hijacked in that sense. The second model of why we use is referred to some as the moral or choice model. Now, this involves a view that we are sentient beings made in God's image, knowing right from wrong, and we have free will. I hate to say this, but a lot of uninformed people singularly embrace this model as a fault of moral turpitude by weak minds or faint hearts. Okay? It's not until it becomes personal for them and they start to learn, if they have somebody in their family or something they love, or maybe themselves, and they start to research, that they change their polemic view. Now, this second model, this choice model, it also includes one's culture, the acceptability to using illicit substance, and the peer pressure involved. If I grew up where drugs were prevalent and used, by most it would take a lot of willpower to abstain. Now, granted, I may use on and off over a course of time, but I do not become addicted, and I'm able to eventually to walk away if my environment changes. Maybe not. Okay. A great example of this is some Native American cultures. They use cannabis or other psychoactive drugs as part of their cultural heritage. I've had clients fitting this example and had treated after coming to the attention of our law enforcement folks. They went through withdrawals, but they had to enter treatment even though this was their surroundings growing up. Everyone was doing it. It was an accepted practice. It was culturally relevant, okay? The last model I'm going to talk about is the self-medicating model. Three reasons why we use, okay, is what we're talking about here. The last one is the self-medicating model. People, they use and are addicted in order to alleviate both physical and emotional pain. We all know of someone who got hurt, put on painkillers, and once the injury healed and the pain disappeared, they found themselves buying and using in an illegal sense. Okay. I had a patient who was an RN. She was working long hours. She went through a really tough divorce and had a lot of responsibility was placed on her in a single parent household. Her answer was methamphetamine, to have the energy to work extra hours and to make ends meet, thinking as a medical professional she could control it. She lost everything and she became homeless. But it's a good story. She's one of the few. She got her nursing license back, and despite several incarcerations, she's doing great now. Along this self-medicating model, the number one client, the most clients I encounter, are those who are addicted to escape the emotional pain and turmoil of their lives. Okay? It comes from childhood abuse, neglect, attachment difficulties, and other emotional traumas. If you like, you can view the previous vlog on personality trauma and resiliency to get a better understanding. In essence, there are three reasons leading to addiction: as a choice, as a way to counter physical or emotional pain by self-medicating, which third eventually leads to a disease concept, and the brain alters its molecular structure. Those are the three reasons we use, and they all are encapsulated as a learned behavior. Now, if you know someone caught up in the trap, or if you are perhaps, please reach out to me. Private message me, agapecounselor at outlook.com. If I can't help you, I'm happy to refer you, but if I can, I'll personally help. I came into this business with a special heart for those just ensnared, and that's why I gravitated to neuropsychology as a counseling paradigm. Okay. God instructs us to use each other. I had a client who made me a beautiful wooden sign that hangs in my Scottsboro office. It reads, "As iron sharpens iron, so does another person's will and design sharpen the willing." Sage words, really it is. So thank you for allowing me to share these 2 questions about addiction, and feel free to contact me. God bless you, and Maranatha.